Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, apologies again for starting late, and thank you very much for coming here and joining us for this special Mary Ward lecture. It's a privilege and honor to welcome you to this year's lecture, and a very special welcome to our distinguished speaker, Professor John Cottingham, and we also warmly welcome John's wife, Myra. I'm going to skip my welcome because I was going to say a little bit about the Institute, but we can tell you later at the drinks if you have any questions, and we can tell you more about the Institute. So I'm going to invite now my colleague, Dr. Ferdia Stone-Davis, who will introduce our speaker properly.
We are absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Cottingham to deliver our Mary Ward lecture today. Professor Cottingham is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Reading University, Professor of Philosophy of Religion at the University of Roehampton, London, and an Honorary Fellow of St John's College in Oxford. The breadth of his work is notable, and he has written extensively on Descartes and on moral philosophy, and his publications on philosophy of religion include On the Meaning of Life, The Spiritual Dimension, Why Believe, Philosophy of Religion Towards a More Humane Approach, and How to Believe. And it is on this last subject that Professor Cottingham will speak to us today. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Ferdy, for those kind words, and thank you too to Anna Abram and to the Margaret Beaufort Institute. It's a great honour and pleasure to be invited here, and thank you too for waiting. I'm so sorry to keep you hanging around. I'd fully expected to come and find an empty room, so I'm very I hope you won't feel the time's been completely wasted. After over 70 years and 10, I still haven't learnt to allow for the traffic, and it's been particularly bad this afternoon. But anyway, here now. So, in my experience, and I'm sure many here will have found the same, one often talks to students, colleagues, friends, and others who clearly have a strong interest in questions of religion and spirituality, but who make it clear that as far as they personally are concerned, they could not see themselves ever becoming believers. For many, religious belief has ceased to be a live option, and it seems doubtful that further intellectual analysis and argument would really change any minds. There's a well-known anecdote about Bertrand Russell, a staunch atheist, of course, who was asked at a dinner party what he would do if he met God in the next world. And Russell allegedly replied, "I should say, God, you did not provide us with sufficient evidence for your existence." But there are other kinds of evidence, I think, than the type Russell might have had in mind. Many things we experience, think of the dynamics of a loving relationship, for example, or the intricacies of a complex piece of classical music, where the phenomena can only be properly apprehended by someone who is suitably receptive. A certain kind of attunement is required. And this in turn may require certain prior changes in the subject experiencing. For example, aesthetic changes, emotional changes, maybe moral changes. When receptivity of this sort is involved, there's certainly evidence for the judgments people make about the various phenomena they're confronting. But it's a rather different kind of evidence, I think, from what we find in the domain of scientific inquiry. And this leads me to wonder whether many people who say they might like to believe but cannot see their way to doing so, may be looking in the wrong place. They may be looking for evidence which provides the kind of certainty or reliability or security, let's say, that a well-established scientific theory may enjoy, but they look in vain for that kind of evidence. And in two recent books, which Ferdy referred to, Why Believe in 2009 and its sequel, How to Believe, 2015, I tried to indicate some alternative directions in which one might look. Now, a religious worldview, if it's to be tenable at all, must not just engage our intellectual faculties, but I think, and our scientific curiosity, for example, but I think it must take account of all the ways in which we respond to the world, including our emotional and imaginative modes of awareness. Now, philosophers in the past have often tended to discount these responses, preferring to take refuge in precise logical abstractions that put them at a certain superior distance from the phenomena they're supposed to be studying. But such distance is, I think, achieved at a cost. It's almost as if there is, in many philosophers, a hypertrophy of the left brain skills, whereby we analyze and dissect and classify phenomena without proper scope being accorded to the right brain skills that facilitate more intuitive and holistic modes of awareness or forms of cognition. Now, I'm well aware that this left brain, right brain business is controversial, and I'm not going into the role of the two hemispheres this afternoon. I think some very interesting philosophical as well as scientific questions connected with the brain's division into two hemispheres, which in fact are constantly interacting in normal subjects. But for these purposes, I'm really just using left brain and right brain as convenient shorthands for two different modes of awareness that we humans enjoy. One, detached, impersonal, analytical. The other, more direct, more involved, more intuitive. And I think many of my philosophical colleagues have tended to privilege what you could call an epistemology of detachment, a standard of knowledge based on cold, detached, perhaps cold is a bit unfair, but based on detached scrutiny of a fairly impersonal kind. Yet there may be many contexts where it seems to me we need to adopt an alternative epistemology, what could be called an epistemology of involvement. There may be truths, and religious truths may be a paradigm case, which only disclose themselves, only become manifest against a background of commitment and emotional involvement. Allowing scope for our imaginative and emotional faculties emphatically does not mean abandoning rationality or moving into some murky domain of pure non-cognitive faith or something like that. It seems clear, I think, that all our faculties are needed for the full flourishing of our humanity, and a belief system that is informed by the full range of human capacities doesn't thereby lose its claim to qualify necessarily, anyway, lose its claim to qualify as a rational, well-grounded system. I've elsewhere argued for the need for what I call a humane turn in philosophy, one that retains the rigor and precision for which philosophy in the analytic tradition is rightly prized, and I'm committed to that, being myself trained in that tradition, but which aims to embrace all the aspects of our human awareness as we confront the world. And I explored some of this in a book called Philosophy of Religion Towards a More Humane Approach, published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. I'm delighted to say there's now a Society for Humane Philosophy, for which I don't claim any credit. It's been started up by two very enterprising younger colleagues, one at the University of Warsaw and one based in Oxford, and they've already held a number of conferences on this theme, and I think it's significant of perhaps a general tendency in philosophy, particularly philosophy of religion, that people are becoming more interested in a slightly less austere way of philosophizing, which doesn't automatically rule out of court the insights of poetry, the arts, imagination, but which still preserves a clear sense of argument, direction of argument. Anyway, to come back to this How to Believe, this title is perhaps in some ways presumptuous, since it may imply that all the readers have a desire to believe in the first place and just waiting to be told how to do it. Yet, of course, I'm well aware that alongside those who might like to believe if they could see their way to doing so, there are many others who have not the slightest desire to become believers and may be irritated when they feel someone's trying to nudge them in that direction. I certainly wouldn't presume to try and convert anyone. Philosophy of religion, I think, is different from the enterprise of apologetics or proselytism, on which some people are engaged, perfectly legitimate enterprise, but rather different from what philosophy of religion is about, I think. But I hope even those who are highly skeptical about religion may find it fruitful to reflect on what you could call the dynamics of religious belief. Religious belief, in my view, turns out to be less about advancing explanatory hypotheses to rival those of science, and less about that than it is about ways of responding to certain deep psychological and moral features of our human predicament. And philosophers, to come back to an earlier point, often assume that these ways of responding must be primarily intellectual. But I think if we look at the dynamics of belief, how people are drawn to a religious worldview and how it actually operates in their lives, then very often it's not the intellectual dimension, but the experiential and above all the practical dimension of religious belief that comes to the fore. So let me now say something about this dimension of praxis or practice. A religious belief system, or religious worldview, if you like, is not acquired from textbooks. I suppose it theoretically could be, but I don't think I know of any such instances where someone has been, as it were, converted to a religious view of the world just by reading textbook arguments. Ludwig Wittgenstein once said that life can educate you to a belief in God. And to understand more about how this works, it may be helpful to begin with the reverse process, where a certain vision of reality disintegrates and loses its hold on us. An example of this, though it's not a religious context, can be found in Mark Twain's description of a decisive shift in his view of the Mississippi River. There's some quotations on a sheet. Does everyone have a copy? Yeah. A broad expanse of the river was turned to blood. In the middle distance, the red hue brightened into gold. where the ruddy flush was faintest, was a smooth spot covered with graceful circles and radiating lines ever so delicately traced. The shore on our left was densely wooded, and high above the forest wall, a clean-stemmed dead tree waved a single leafy bough that glowed like a flame in the unobstructed splendor that was flowing from the sun. But a day came when I began to cease from noting the glories and the charms which the moon and sun and twilight wrought upon the river's face. All the value any feature of it had for me now was the amount of usefulness it could furnish towards compassing the safe piloting of a steamboat. It should probably be read in an American accent to get the full flavor of the Twain account of his various journeys on the Mississippi. And clearly the enraptured vision of the beauty, the delicate beauty of the flowing water and the sunlit woods seems at first, I think, as you read that passage, so vivid, so powerful, that nothing could shake it. But then the writer is, or the narrator, is progressively worn down by the demanding daily chores of navigation. And these wondrous aspects of the river just cease to become salient. The glory and the freshness of a dream, to borrow a phrase of William Wordsworth, finally dies away and fades into the light of common day. The reality hasn't changed, nor have the narrator's perceptual abilities been disabled, but the difference has come about through action as a result of the daily, weekly routines that are now part of his life and which have subtly but irreversibly, perhaps, certainly inexorably, reconfigured his orientation towards the world. We sometimes like to think of ourselves as detached in the position of wholly autonomous, detached evaluators, scrutinizing various pictures of the world, worldviews, and deciding, that one's for me. That is the worldview I'll adopt. But the reality is, of course, that from our birth, from our conception, I guess, onwards, we are biologically embodied creatures, subject to all the physical processes that implies. And these have become very common points for people to make in philosophy. As we grow and learn, we're shaped and formed, not just biologically, but by what the people around us do, our parents, our teachers, and by the patterns of behavior into which we're inducted, to use a phrase of John McDowell, inducted by the demands of first of parental upbringing and later education and employment. As Martin Heidegger might have put it, we humans are always already located, immer schon, this irritating but somehow apt phrase, we're always already located in an embodied world of context and action. So I think it follows that the entire inquiry about how to believe, ways of forming a belief system, the whole inquiry needs to be understood as involving an intrinsic reference to action as well as cognition. It's an inquiry about practice as much as about theory. As you know, there's the ancient puzzle called Zeno's paradox about how Achilles can ever, it was one of the paradoxes, about how Achilles can never overtake the tortoise, because in order to, by the time he's got halfway there, the tortoise will have moved a little forward, and when he's covered that distance a tiny bit more, and so on. An ancient, so he can never actually win the race. But an ancient response to that is, to this paradox, is solvitur ambulando. It's solved by walking it through. And if you actually run the race, you just see that Achilles very swiftly, few strides, overtakes the tortoise. So do the experiment, run the race. The analogous thought in the religious case might be that, well, somewhat as follows: deciding on whether to accept a theistic worldview can't be a purely intellectual decision made at a safe distance from the context of life and action. So instead of agonizing about whether there's sufficient evidence to support such a worldview, why not run the experiment? Start imitating the actions and practices of the believer and see if that makes a difference. Now that suggestion, as I'm sure will recall for many, the suggestion of Blaise Pascal several centuries ago, who remarked, this is B on the sheet, I think, who remarked that those who want to cure themselves of unbelief should look at others who've become converted. They are cured of the malady for which you seek a cure, so follow them, begin as they did, by acting as if they believed, taking holy water, having masses said, and so on. In the natural course of events, this itself will make you believe. This will train you. The French word is abêtir, will manage you. Of course, the verb has the connotation of treating like an animal, and the way the animal is trained, this will soften you up. This will get you into the right state in the way you train a horse or dog, perhaps. I mean, in a way that may seem rather cynical. Pascal's undermining his case there by making it all very like mechanical training. But like several other thinkers of the period, Descartes is an example, Pascal's near contemporary. They were very interested in what was emerging as an early theory of stimulus response and what we now call Pavlovian training. So you can get animals to do various things by repeating rewards or repeating stimuli. And if you can do that with animals, then why can't we do it for ourselves, as it were, admittedly guided by reason, but by laying down the similar automatic pathways. Now, that may seem a bit too much like brainwashing for comfort, but I think it's possible to interpret Pascal in a more sympathetic way. There's a certain British monarch. I haven't been able to trace this anecdote, but I think it may have been George V, but perhaps someone may be able to enlighten me. He's reported to have written to his wife that he did not love her when they were first betrothed, but that he'd grown to love her after many years of marriage. It may not seem the most tactful of compliments to pay to one's spouse, but it has a certain integrity, and when arranged marriages were common in royal circles, as they still are in many cultures today, such experiences may have been quite commonplace. That idea, I didn't love you much, but I've learned to love, may outrage today's sort of Hollywood-driven conception of love at first sight. But it may be closer to the reality of many human loving relationships than we often admit. For the truth, surely, is that one can't immediately love someone, except in the sense of being struck or infatuated by some quality which simply, as people say, bowls you over. Genuine love implies knowledge, and knowledge of a person is something that necessarily grows over time. The importance of praxis or behavior in this kind of context is crucial, I think. A person's moral and emotional and intellectual qualities, the qualities which have to be understood and appreciated if genuine love of them is to take root, can't be scrutinized at a distance as if they were exhibits in a show. Or if anyone did try to assess someone's qualities in that clinical way, that would probably be the shortest way of freezing out or paralyzing the expression, the full flourishing of those qualities. Such qualities have to be allowed to emerge spontaneously in a climate of receptivity, to go back to that crucial term, and indeed of slow nurturing. So daily actions of consideration and gentleness will be vital catalysts, allowing the possibility of a climate developing in which a person's true qualities, their true self, can emerge, thus allowing affection to flourish and ripen into full love. And I think what holds good for the kind of awareness required for authentic love to take root may well also be true for the sensitivity required for an authentic religious outlook to take root. Certain repeated, even habitual patterns of action may be the best way of focusing the kind of fostering the kind of focused receptivity which leads to new perceptions. And these new perceptions may in turn prompt further action, which in turn may become absorbed into a repeated pattern of behavior, which opens the door to further, deeper perceptions. A kind of upward spiral, if you like, of belief, fortified and energized by action. This is obviously a complex, dynamic process, much more than a matter of routine or habit. I mean, if spiritual praxis degenerates into mere routine, it loses its efficacy as a catalyst of change in this way. That brings one on to quotation C from Henri Bergson, La pensée et le mouvement. Our inner experience, extract C, quotation C, our inner experience shows us in habit an activity that's passed by imperceptible degrees from consciousness into unconsciousness and from will to automatism. Habit thus gives us a living demonstration of the truth that mechanism is not sufficient unto itself. It is, so to speak, only the fossilized residue of a spiritual activity. A finely nuanced description of how this kind of process can operate is provided by Claire Carlyle in a very interesting book on habit. She takes the example of the Eucharist and its role in Christian praxis and belief. I won't read the whole quotation, but she's saying there that taking communion involves a posture of receptivity. Recipient holds out her hands to accept what the priest offers her, bowing her head in thanks, and consumes the sacrament. The posture embodies the theological idea that her virtue, while genuinely hers, has its source in God. When the ritual's repeated regularly, it serves as a reminder that helps to maintain in the lives of the believers the connection between freedom and dependence that's so central to Christian doctrine. More generally, the sacrament of the Eucharist is for Christians the ultimate expression of receptivity to God, the highest good. There's a lot more in the quotation which bears consideration, I think. What I'd really want to underline in this context is that spiritual praxis, in the form of patterns of regular worship, behavior, action, is not just a kind of accidental or contingent accompaniment to the acceptance of a worldview, nor is it, as in Pascal, a kind of means to facilitate the adoption of a worldview or a means to get you on the road to conversion. Rather, it's part and parcel of what it is to be involved in, to possess such a worldview. It's, as it were, the very enactment of such an outlook in the life of the believer. Something that can no more be separated from it. The praxis can't be separated from the reality, the belief, than can the regular, repeated patterns of action, of relevant action, be separated from a loving relationship. For example, smiles, embraces, focused attention towards the beloved. These are not accompaniments or facilitators of love, but its very embodiment. So, going back to religious belief, what applies to the praxis of the ordinary believer holds good, I think, even more in the case of the praxis of those who've taken the vows of a religious order, where the disciplines of the liturgy structure almost every waking hour. It's described rather nicely, I think, in a passage from the Benedictine monk and theologian Luigi Gioia. This is E on the sheet. Liturgical activity transforms cosmic, historical, and biological rhythms into salvation history. The night becomes a time of waiting for the Lord, rising of the sun, the time to celebrate creation, the succession of daily hours, an ascent to the heavenly Jerusalem, the end of the day, a celebration of redemption, sleep, an act of abandonment in God's hands. In this way, the monk constantly remembers he's not the creator and savior of himself, but is a creature. The very routines of everyday life, such as waking and sleeping, are here transformed or sacramentalized by liturgical structures that punctuate each day. Now, such totality of commitment is clearly not for everyone. Gioia is describing the religious life, which is a special case, perhaps. But I think you could argue that all religious believers, certainly in the three great Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are implicitly or explicitly committed to the idea of the sacramentality of everyday life. The central idea here is that religious allegiance is by no means simply a matter of intellectual assent or even moral orientation, but is something that has to be enacted and embodied in an intimate intermingling of belief and praxis that can set the tenor of an entire lived human life. And similar things, I think, can be said about structures that we find in other religions, as, for example, in Islam, the call to salat, the obligatory prayers performed 5 times a day, before sunrise, at midday, late afternoon, after sunset, and between sunset and midnight. The rhythms of the day and night, of rising, retiring, are woven into the practice of worship. So it's incorporated into a pattern of living. Fairly straightforward idea, really. And in a similar way, I think the patterns of the year, the darkness and silence of winter and the bursting into new life in the spring, are kind of take shape insofar as they're enacted in the Christian solemnities of Christmas and Easter. An ancient ritual which is still observed in some Christian communities marks the end of the long winter and the hope of new life by the lighting of a brazier outside the church at the Vigil Mass on the eve of Easter. The Saturday just immediately preceding Easter Sunday, often called the first Mass of Easter, even though it often takes place at night when it's still dark, to quote one of the resurrection narratives. In the silence of the night, the cold night, the people gather, and a taper is lit that will be taken into the church and used to light the Paschal candle. As the flicker of light enters the darkened church, the cantor intones Lumen Christi, the light of Christ, and the response is Deo gratias, thanks be to God. Such enactments are clearly more than the sum of their parts. The faithful observance of these enactments doesn't, of course, itself make true the belief system that the adherents subscribe to, but it conveys the meaning of that belief system more directly and vividly than any abstract theorizing could conveniently do. But for this to happen, the praxis has to be authentic. Now, that's a difficult notion to define, I think, what counts as authentic liturgy, authentic praxis. But it's got to be capable of being enacted in a dignified, sincere, and mindful way. That's a minimum, I think. And you can see how easily that can go wrong when we look at how the poet John Betjeman talks of the rituals of Christmas. This is F from a poem called Christmas, 1954 or thereabouts. And is it true, the most tremendous tale of all, seen in a stained glass window's hue, a baby in an ox's stall, the maker of the stars and sea, become a child on earth for me. Now, I don't know what you think about that verse, but something about this sentimental image, the stained glass, which depicts the baby in an ox's stall, fails, at least for me, to resonate properly. And the repeated question, but is it true, and is it true, is in one way exactly the wrong question to ask, or rather the very asking of it is a sign that there's been a loss of authenticity in the praxis. And if you read the rest of the poem, it goes on to talk about caroling in the frosty air and the steeple-shaking bells, the conventional, in other words, paraphernalia depicted in Christmas cards, which combines with the stained glass windows hue to give us a vague, warm, comfortable feeling. Now, it would be unfair, I think, to Betjeman to say the poet mistakes the paraphernalia for the reality. Indeed, the close of the poem, which I haven't quoted in full there, goes on to say that none of it can compare with the single truth of the incarnation, if, the poem goes on to say, that is true, if it is true. So it's not a question of impugning the sincerity of the poet or the poem, but rather pointing to a certain sentimentality in the cosy vision of Christmas night that already shows, perhaps, that it doesn't represent a fully valid structure of spirituality. But now I saw a few people frowning when I said that the truth question, and is it true, is in one way exactly the wrong question to ask. By that I most emphatically don't mean that truth is irrelevant, or that aesthetically pleasing liturgical praxis can be a substitute for truth. Now, I know some people want to aestheticize religion completely and say, oh, it's just, there's lovely old buildings, lovely choral singing, this is what it's all about. Now, that I think, won't work. On the contrary, liturgy, praxis, practice would be mere acting, mere flummery, if it were not grounded in a conception of the nature of the underlying reality and its meaning for human life. But the problem, so that's not the problem with Betjeman's question, but is it true, but is it true? I think the problem really is that it jumps in up front too early with a demand to settle the truth question straight off as a precondition for going further. It's like that eager suitor in the back of my mind from one of P.G. Wodehouse's Bertie Wooster novels, who just 5 minutes after being introduced to a young woman blurts out, "I must know, do you love me?" So the question, as it were, the only possible response to such a question is one similar to what Bertrand Russell gave to the young Wittgenstein, who, when he arrived in Cambridge, I'm sure you all know this anecdote, burst into Russell's rooms at Trinity and said, "Will you please tell me, am I a complete idiot?" To which Russell replied, "My dear fellow, I don't know." Because the question came too early. The truth question came too early. More generally, I mean, the point I'm making here is that to understand to answer the truth question properly, you first need to understand the meaning of what's being asserted. I mean, the logical positivists of the 1930s got it exactly the wrong way round. They thought that verification conditions determined meaning. But the peremptory demand for isolated verification is a hangover from this discredited philosophy, which I think no philosophers now accept, known as logical positivism. A kind of obsession with checking each proposition atomistically against a supposed state of affairs which it's supposed to conform to or describe. Observational evidence. But to go back to my earlier example, to truthfully answer the question of whether one loves someone, for example, one must first understand the meaning of love. No easy task. And of course, one must also first understand and know the person in question. And both these requirements may take a lot of time and effort. So it is mutatis mutandis with the truth of the incarnation or of any other central doctrine of Christianity or any other faith. We may wish things were much simpler than that, as the social media have started to condition us to want, where you react to something with a like or dislike, kind of immediate snap judgment, thumbs up or thumbs down to affirm your agreement or disagreement. But if we're proposing to accept or reject a complex doctrine such as the incarnation, which is supposed to encapsulate profound truths about human salvation, that kind of quick decision, is it true, yes or no, simply is not possible. Something of the complexity, I think, required is conveyed in an Anguished Christmas meditation, which I set against Betjeman's, written by Gerard Manley Hopkins, writing nearly a century before John Betjeman, in verses that are much more hesitant than the peremptory Betjeman-style demand to settle the truth question straight off. I'm coming swiftly to a close now. This is the Hopkins quotation G. Moonless darkness stands between, past, O past, no more be seen. But the Bethlehem star may lead me to the sight of him who freed me from the self that I have been. now beginning and always, now begin on Christmas Day. So in the darkness of a wasted past, the speaker sees a glimmer of light showing the road to be taken. And that brings us back to the importance of praxis, obviously, and the idea I've been touching on several times, that the various elements of praxis are not just decorative embellishments, but have the vital function of deepening our understanding, not just on an abstract intellectual level, but by infusing themselves into layers of our moral and spiritual awareness. One analogy here is with a kind of clarifying crystal, set of crystals that you drop into a murky glass, which slowly clarifies the mixture as it sinks into the sludge. And if you push that analogy further, you could think of the crystals as producing not just having not just a cleansing function, but producing a real chemical change. So the mixture is not just clarified, but its molecular structure is transformed. So I think that hints at how spiritual praxis has the function, or can have the function at its best, of transforming us psychologically, physically, and above all, morally. Because authentic religious liturgy is not just a free spinning wheel that looks pretty, but a form of practical enactment that orients us, designed to orient us towards the moral demand that's at the center of the Judeo-Christian outlook, the demand to change. Authentic religion requires a response from us and provides a structure of practical enactment that facilitates and sustains that response. If it fails to do that, it's no longer a live option, but it's become a kind of fossilized relic. And perhaps for many readers of Betjeman's poem, it had already become just that, as it has for many people today. Well, I know we started late, so I don't know whether we should pause there. There are some further things I was going to say about the sacred, but I think I perhaps will leave that. Does the shake of the hand mean don't leave it? Yes. We've got about 3 minutes more, I think. So let me just quickly say that. This is just a brief word in conclusion about how this notion of spiritual practice connects with the idea of the sacred. It's a very difficult notion to define philosophically, but I suspect many of us can point to moments of deep significance in our lives where we found ourselves, so to speak, on the threshold of the sacred. And some may not want to use that word sacred because of may want to avoid any religious connotations it has. But the kind of experience I have in mind, certainly not confined to believers, those who've signed up for a particular faith or denomination or whatever. For some people it may happen before uplifting works of painting or sculpture. For others, in an overwhelming emotion generated by a natural landscape of great beauty. For others, in what happens to them when they're absorbed by a great work of music, where in Roger Scruton's phrase, and I think it was he who gave this lecture last year, we are, although I don't know if he discussed this particular question of the sacred, this is Scruton, we sense a bottomless chasm in the scheme of things, of falling away into the transcendental, and ourselves poised on the as poised on the edge. I think part of the point is that the world that we have to deal with in order to survive in our day-to-day needs makes us make use of things in all sorts of ways. But when we approach the threshold of the sacred, then these ordinary mundane needs are temporarily put aside. We no longer confront reality as tool makers or biological exploiters or technological manipulators. Time seems to be suspended. We're overwhelmed by a certain stillness or an awe, A-W-E, an R, as it's pronounced in American English. So an encounter with the sacred calls us to suspend the instrumental attitude that treats everything as a commodity to be used. The crucial thing about this response of awe, a genuine sense of the sacred, is that there's something that says keep off. As Moses' encounter with the burning bush in the Exodus story has it, he was warned not to approach too near. This sense that our normal mundane enterprises are somehow checked or halted, I think is something that contemporary secular accounts of the sacred have missed, secular accounts of the sacred, or at least perhaps not fully taken on board. I mean, it's obviously true that deep experiences of wonder at the beauty of nature or of great art can come to any human being, irrespective of whether they're religious or not, at least whether they have explicit religious allegiance or not. But there's a special quality, I think, to these experiences, which shows that they're much more than just a matter of subjective buzz, saying wow as you watch the sunset, for example. It's perhaps rather an unfair way of putting it, but the point is that they have a significance. In Paradise Lost, that great epic poem, John Milton plays on an ancient etymological connection between the holy and the accursed, Latin sacer, S-A-C-E-R, from which we get sacred, where Adam calls the fruit of the forbidden tree sacred. That sacred fruit, he says, sacred to abstinence. It was sacred precisely because it was set apart from the other fruits of the garden, the one they were not to touch. And in failing to keep off, they made it accursed. Its taste, as Milton puts it, brought death into the world and all our woe. So the sense of awe, the true sense of awe, that's the basis of the religious impulse, is not, as it's sometimes maliciously or ignorantly represented as being, a kind of superstitious servility towards these arbitrary commands of a divine tyrant. Rather, it's a recognition that there's a dimension to reality that requires our respect, a value that confronts us whether we like it or not, that calls us to refrain from grabbing and grasping, and which is not simply there for us to control and commodify. And I'll just close with 3 verses from a well-known psalm, Cantate Domino Canticum Novum, Sing unto the Lord a new song, Psalm 96 or 95 in the Vulgate. This is H. Let the heavens be glad, let the earth rejoice, let the sea roar and all it contains, let the field exult and all that is in it. Then all the trees of the forest will sing for joy before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness. Now, God here is not a sort of immaterial, spooky force that's supposed to explain the behavior of the oceans and the fields and the woods. Rather, the vivid beauty and splendor of the natural world is that which makes manifest the divine. The world is understood religiously, not as a blank, impersonal process, not as A.E. Housman's heartless, witless nature, not as a manifestation of blind, pitiless indifference, to use a phrase of Richard Dawkins, but as charged with the grandeur of God. This is the vision powerfully expressed by Gerard Manley Hopkins. This is J, the last quotation on the sheet, when he spoke in a notebook of all, and it of course connects with the famous poem, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God." But in the notebook he speaks of things, all things as being charged with love, charged with God, so that if we know how to touch them, they give off sparks and take fire, yield drops and flow, ring and tell of him. There's an earlier psalm where God is described as the one who breaks the cedars of Lebanon and strips the forest bare, while all in the temple cry glory. And that cry of glory, in Hebrew, kavod, alludes to something overwhelming, sacred, mysterious, a manifestation of the divine, like the burning bush, flaming but never consumed, where Moses was told to keep his distance. These are not impressive sights of the kind familiar from TV, nature programs, but events pregnant with moral significance, as is clear from the verse in our psalm, where the forests sing for joy, not just, I think, in kind of pantheistic exuberance, but, as it goes on to say, because the world is to be judged. So in psychological or phenomenological terms, if you like, what it feels like for the subject, what's happening here is an experience where the subject's overwhelmed by the power and beauty of nature, but in a way that's somehow intertwined with awareness of one's own weakness and imperfection, and a sense of confrontation with the inexorable demands of righteousness. So for someone who's caught up in such an experience, the question how to believe kind of drops out as irrelevant. The religious understanding involved here is the kind of awareness that enables one to see the world transfigured. So it's irradiated with meaning, value, and the human subject caught up in that mystery is called upon not just to be a spectator, a mere tourist, but to respond, to be a morally responsive agent, part of a cosmos that is, if you like, diaphanous, transparent to the divine. And this, in the end, is what seems to me religious belief is all about. Not signing up to abstruse metaphysical doctrines or theories, but rather being caught up in a process of transformation whose power and authority cannot easily be denied.
Thank you very much. I know now we're due to go upstairs, but I think it would be nice if you have any questions to pose those to John.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor, for your very interesting talk. I'm sitting listening to your words, and I'm thinking of people whom I know who are entirely non-religious, and they simply wouldn't understand the notion of self-transcendence and the sense of the divine or the sacred beyond the normal everyday practical world. They just wouldn't sort of get it. They wouldn't be in that mindset at all. And I just wondered if we could think about it. I mean, the major religions that we have were all grounded within people who had a completely different mindset to how we all live today. For them it was completely natural that the world was sacramental and that God was shot through with everything, whichever, the forces that it was normal. And I do wonder if perhaps you talk about praxis, by daily doing something it sort of changes who we are. And I'm wondering if the whole events of what we now call the Enlightenment, which changed how we think about the world. The only way of truth is to get at empirical truth, and the only way to find it is through the scientific method. And even for those, or perhaps even particularly for those who aren't actually practicing scientists, but who are just lay people who understand that way of thinking,
Yeah.
maybe it's been dripped into them to such an extent that it's now almost impossible to get people out of that way of thinking. I can't find the words sometimes when I'm with non-believing people. It's as if they're not able to be jolted out of this into the sort of space that you would describe.
No, I think I do agree with that, and with the idea that the root of it lies in certain kinds of Enlightenment thinking. Not that I'm against the modern movement in philosophy at all. I mean, I think Descartes, going right through to Kant, that period was immensely rich and has a lot to teach us. But I think, as so often, what the philosophers themselves say is sometimes quite sensible, but the way it percolates through into certain prejudices has been damaging or led to confusions. And one such confusion is the privileging of the scientific image over what the philosopher Sellers called the manifest image. That's to say, I mean, even a philosopher as brilliant as Bertrand Russell once said, the real table is not solid. You know, it's not because it's composed of atoms that are largely empty space. And you often hear people saying, things aren't really coloured, of course. You know, roses aren't really red. Now, of course roses are red. No science, no philosophy could ever show they're not. Some stars are yellow, some are blue. There are genuine differences in things. Of course, it's true that those manifest properties are caused by or associated by micro properties, molecular structure or photons bouncing off. But it's not that the photons and the molecules are more real than tables and chairs. Both are equally real. In fact, in some ways, I think we can say the table and chairs are more real, because that's where you have to start from. So I think you're right in saying these more, if you like, human-oriented properties are things which many people think are just the stuff that we add, and the only real stuff is the atoms and the jangling of molecules or whatever. But I think that is a philosophical confusion. The manifest properties of things are just as genuine. Now, it would take a long time to, but that would be the first step, I think. And then once we start to accept the reality of colours and hues and shapes and trees and valleys and rivers, then we're not so far from spiritual experience, as Wordsworth said. And he said, therefore am I still a lover of the valleys, and I can't quote the passage from memory, but I'm sure lots of people know it.
Thank you very much. I warmed to an awful lot of that, and it's certainly my experience, but it seemed to me that one thing that was missing, certainly of our experience as being Christians, if that's where we're coming from, is the whole idea of community. Mm-hmm. Because it seemed very much as if you were describing personal experiences, which I think everybody has. Yeah. But whether or not those privileged experiences are particularly experiences of God, it seems to me is debatable, to say the least. And you have to ask what happens to people who are not in the position where they see beautiful things. Somebody who's living in slums, in incredibly deprived areas where they watch their children die. Where is their grasp on God? I mean, the early Christians, we are told, these Christians see how they love one another. Yeah. That surely is can't be left out of the discussion.
No, that's clearly a very good point. I mean, I don't think I entirely left it out, though, because I did talk about the sense of the moral demand. And that, I think, is one key element of a spiritual experience. It's not just, the stained glass window. That's kind of aestheticizing that you find, I think, in that Betjeman and some other sentimental poets before and after him. But rather, there is a sense of the beauty of the world and the beauty of certain human creations too. But it's infused, as in that psalm, all the forests, trees of the forest shall sing for joy, for he comes to judge them. So it's not just that we can think, oh, and some people are very like this in their attitude to Christian, lovely old churches. Some have heard someone saying the other day, I don't know why you Catholics always have such tatty churches on the outskirts of town. Why don't you have lovely old churches like we Anglicans? With apparently seeming complete ignorance of the fact that they were all pinched. But anyway, that sort of lovely old buildings, people want, English are very susceptible. They want to live in a lovely old farmhouse and have nothing wrong with that, perhaps in itself. But it's this kind of aestheticizing rather than... and I think the key to a genuine experience of the kind you find in Hopkins, for example, is nearly always linked to a moral response. So often in his sonnets, the what's it called, the first 8 lines, the octet, is about nature, but then the sestet, the final 6 lines of the sonnet, returns us to some kind of moral demand. And that, I think it goes right back to the roots of the Judaic and Christian traditions. Moses, Samuel, they're all called and required to do something, and often, of course, that relates to their community. The prophets, for example, are required to go and stop something horrible that's happening. So I fully concur with that.
Thank you, it's fascinating. I was just curious, if I understood rightly, the comparison with being in love with someone was that I'm not first in love and then act lovingly towards the person, but I can sort of train myself to fall in love with someone through acting lovingly towards them. And in the same way, I could sort of train myself into religious belief through engaging in certain practices. But then I suppose my question would be, how do I know which kinds of practices? Because we've talked about everything here, from communion to poetry to nature, but surely it unavoidably implicates me in metaphysical and theological questions of, what is God? Yes. Because, if, for instance, Christians are right that God is Jesus incarnate, then some form of devotional practice towards, the person of Christ should be efficacious.
Yeah.
But if they're wrong about that, then that practice might be entirely, without any sort of effect in terms of my relationship with God.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Yes, part of the argument is the Pascalian one, that you can train yourself. But I wanted, and actually I discussed this in much more detail in the book, How to Believe, but I wanted to move on from just the Pascalian idea of training, if you like, to the idea that the praxis, entering into praxis, reveals certain evidence. So further down the line, you enter into a certain pattern of behavior which opens you to and puts you in a position to see certain evidence which supports a certain view of reality. So it's not as if we've got animal training set against evidential theory, evidence-based theory. It's rather the practical immersion opens the door to evidence which could then make it rational to believe. And I do want to preserve, if you like, the traditional Catholic, I suppose you could call it, that fusion between faith and reason. The idea that authentic religious belief can't be blind faith just launching out 50,000 fathoms deep, as Kierkegaard put it, but has to be at least partly supported by the engagement of our rational faculties. However, to be absolutely honest, I am skeptical about the limits of metaphysics. I think most philosophers have to be since Kant's first critique. And the idea that we can pronounce on the ultimate nature of the divine, I think not just for Enlightenment or Kantian reasons, but for mainstream Christian theological reasons, is pretty dubious. You know, Augustine, I hate this word famously that people, because it implies you all ought to know this. But Augustine famously said, si comprehendis non est Deus. If you comprehend him, he's not God. The very fact that you mapped it out, your metaphysical theory, shows that you haven't reached the infinite reality that is God. And Descartes, I think, says something very close to that, where he talks about God being the mountain that we can't comprehendo in Latin, or comprendre in French. We can't put our arms around it, can't grasp it, encompass it in our thought, but we can maybe approach it, finite though we are, and perhaps even touch it in our thought. The phrasing there is actually very reminiscent of St. Augustine, as often in Descartes. So I hope that indicates some lines of response. Anyway.
It's time for maybe just one more question. I see there's one there.
So would it try and keep it simple, because I'm not an intellectual or an academic like yourself. But if you go back to the Billy Graham crusades and the salvation prayer, because you at one point you said, I'm not here to convert people, you know. But with Billy Graham, and my own view as well, is that conversion is just for the Holy Spirit, because you were talking about spiritual truths. So it's the Holy Spirit that converts, even though we can guide people a certain way. But because it's their spiritual truths, like it's only the Holy Spirit, and that's what the Billy Graham, the Crusades were all about, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about how those crusades worked. I can remember his tours from my childhood when he came. You know, he included England in some of those tours. But as I understand it, part of the process is opening people's emotions out so they're receptive, which is why passages from Scripture which are supposed to move people are often read out in these charismatic and other crusade enterprises. And I think that that's at least compatible with what I was saying about the move towards belief not being just a purely intellectual matter of examining the arguments, but a matter of change, undergoing change, and the change involved must draw on all the resources of the human mind, imaginative, emotional, not just intellectual. What is the agent of change? I think that takes us into theology, which I'm not probably competent to. But I think, again, it's a fairly mainstream view, going back to Aquinas at least, Thomas Aquinas, that some of the virtues necessary for faith, hope, and love, in particular, have to be infused from above, as he puts it. That's why he calls those three the theological virtues, because we can't do them by our own efforts alone. So I think that's consistent with what you're saying. Yeah.
Just ask one thing. Okay. I'm thinking that there's something in the modern mind about actually, when we've studied it will all become explicable. You know, there's an answer for everything. It's very much the sort of driving of science. And that is part of the problem, because, you know, if everything's explicable, there's nothing that's inexplicable that is what we would think of as God, because we can't get there. So there's something about this modern myth that if we only think hard enough, we'll understand everything: music, love, wickedness, And I think that is not a realistic attitude to the world, really.
I very much agree. I don't think it's the truly scientific attitude to the world either. I think though many of the great scientists, Newton is the example that comes to mind, often said, the passage about him saying he was just a child on the seashore, do you know the one I mean, playing with pebbles in comparison with the infinite cosmos. Stephen Hawking, however, did say in that book, A Brief History of Time, that we were not far from getting a grand theory of everything, and then we would know the mind of God. It's not quite clear what he meant by that, but certainly I think some people, their conception is that science will wrap it all up. Maybe in 1 decade, 2 decades, we'll have the theory that fuses relativity with quantum theory, and then that'll be the end of the story.
I think that's rather deeply held by a lot of people.
Yeah, and I don't think it's... certainly none of the scientists I know have that very arrogant view. On the contrary, they often talk of things like an unending quest, as Karl Popper did. So I think, but I agree, it's a pervasive feature of, and it connects with the idea that our technology will sort everything out. Like the idea that we can sort death out. I saw a piece in some paper the other day which said, we're the last generation to be mortal. We'll fix this death problem for the next generation. And that is rather like the idea that we can solve everything with.
And that certainly the world is ultimately self-explanatory, which clearly is, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, it's part of the same hubris, I think, which Luigi Gioia was talking about when talked about the need to acknowledge that we aren't self-creating, but we are creatures.